Berlin, August 1943. The city sleeps uneasily under blackout conditions, always expecting Allied bombers. But tonight, something different falls from the sky. Not bombs, paper. Thousands of leaflets drift down through the darkness, landing on streets, rooftops, and courtyards throughout the German capital. By morning, Berliners wake to find their city carpeted with propaganda. But this isn't ordinary propaganda. This leaflet is different. It contains names, specific names of Nazi officials who've allegedly been dealing with the Allies. It lists addresses of supposed resistance safe houses. It describes secret SS operations. It reveals details about German intelligence activities that only insiders could know. And most terrifyingly for Nazi authorities, it's accurate. The information is real. Within hours, panic spreads through Berlin's Nazi hierarchy. If the Allies know these secrets, who's leaking them? How deep does Allied intelligence penetration go? Are there traitors in the highest levels of the Reich? The Gestapo launches frantic investigations. Hundreds are arrested on suspicion. Trust evaporates as Nazis suspect each other of espionage. The Nazi security apparatus turns inward, consuming itself in paranoid witch hunts triggered by a single leaflet operation. Welcome to Cipher Tales. Today, we decode one of World War II's most successful psychological warfare operations, the spy leaflet that sparked panic in Berlin. This is the story of how British intelligence crafted a propaganda leaflet so perfectly calibrated, so precisely targeted, so devastatingly accurate that it triggered a crisis within Nazi Germany's security services. This is the story of how one piece of paper dropped from the sky accomplished what bombs couldn't, creating paranoia, destroying trust, and paralyzing German counterintelligence with fear that their own organizations had been penetrated. This is the story of propaganda as a precision weapon. The context: Berlin under siege. To understand the psychological impact of this leaflet, we must first understand Berlin in 1943, a city under increasing pressure where the Nazi regime's grip was tightening in response to mounting threats from within and without. By summer 1943, the tide of World War II had turned decisively against Nazi Germany. The Wehrmacht had suffered catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad. North Africa was lost. Italy was teetering toward collapse. Allied bombers struck German cities with increasing frequency and devastating effect. The invincibility myth that Nazi propaganda had cultivated was shattering against brutal reality. Berlin felt the war's weight particularly heavily. As the Reich's capital, it was a primary target for Allied bombing campaigns. The RAF's night raids and USAF's daylight bombing runs turned sections of the city into ruins. Civilians endured nightly terror in bomb shelters, emerging to find neighborhoods destroyed. Food rationing intensified. Casualties mounted. The home front was suffering, and propaganda couldn't completely hide the suffering from Berlin's population. Nazi authorities responded to these pressures by increasing internal security measures. The Gestapo, secret state police, intensified surveillance of German civilians, hunting for defeatism, dissent, or resistance activity. The SD, Nazi Party Intelligence Service, monitored morale, compiling reports about civilian attitudes that increasingly alarmed Nazi leadership. The apparatus of fear and control tightened as external threats grew. In this paranoid atmosphere, Nazi officials were already deeply concerned about Allied intelligence penetration. They knew the Allies had sophisticated spy networks. They suspected that resistance movements inside Germany were communicating with Allied intelligence. They worried about traitors in their own organizations, communists who'd infiltrated Nazi institutions, German aristocrats who opposed Hitler, military officers who questioned the Führer's leadership. These fears weren't entirely unfounded. Anti-Nazi resistance networks did exist within Germany. Groups like the Kreisauer Circle, aristocrats and intellectuals plotting against Hitler, operated in secret. Military officers increasingly doubted German victory and contemplated coup possibilities that would culminate in the July 1944 assassination attempt. Communist resistance networks maintained clandestine activities despite brutal suppression, and some Germans did provide intelligence to the Allies, driven by conscience, ideology, or pragmatism. But distinguishing real threats from imagined ones was nearly impossible. The Nazi security apparatus saw conspiracies everywhere. Internal surveillance generated mountains of reports suggesting disloyalty, but determining which reports indicated genuine threats versus personal vendettas, misunderstandings, or paranoid overinterpretation was extraordinarily difficult. Nazi counterintelligence was drowning in noise, struggling to identify signals. Into this environment, a city under bombing stress, a population under surveillance pressure, a Nazi hierarchy paranoid about internal enemies, and a security apparatus overwhelmed by suspected threats, British intelligence prepared to drop a psychological weapon designed to exploit every vulnerability. The leaflet wasn't meant primarily to influence German civilians. Its target was the Nazi security services themselves. The goal was making them destroy themselves through paranoid internal investigations triggered by the leaflet's revelations. This was sophisticated psychological warfare at the strategic level. British intelligence understood that creating internal chaos within Nazi Germany could be as valuable as military victories. If Nazi security services turned inward, hunting traitors in their own ranks, they'd have fewer resources for hunting Allied spies and resistance networks. If Nazi officials stopped trusting each other, coordination would suffer and effectiveness would decline. And if a single leaflet could trigger this cascade of paranoia, the cost-benefit ratio was extraordinarily favorable. The intelligence, building the weapon. Creating a leaflet capable of sparking panic among Nazi officials required extraordinary intelligence gathering and sophisticated understanding of Nazi organizational psychology. British intelligence services spent months preparing the operation. The Political Warfare Executive, Britain's psychological warfare agency, coordinated with MI6, Special Operations Executive, and various intelligence analysis units to compile the necessary information. The leaflet needed to contain details that were accurate enough to convince Nazi officials it came from genuine internal sources, but calibrated carefully to maximize psychological impact without compromising actual Allied intelligence operations.
Intelligence came from multiple sources. MI6 maintained networks of agents throughout German-occupied Europe and even within Germany itself. Some were German citizens opposed to Nazism. Others were foreign nationals working in Germany. Still others were bureaucrats in neutral countries who had access to information about German activities. These human intelligence sources provided raw data about Nazi officials, organizational structures, and internal dynamics. Signals intelligence from Bletchley Park, Britain's famous code-breaking operation, provided additional information. British cryptographers had broken various German codes, allowing them to read encrypted communications between Nazi organizations. This signals intelligence revealed details about Nazi officials' activities, internal communications, and security concerns that would never appear in public sources. Escaped prisoners, defectors, and refugees provided insider perspectives. Germans who fled the Nazi regime or Allied prisoners who escaped from German captivity brought detailed knowledge of conditions inside Germany, Nazi organizational structures, and personalities of individual Nazi officials. Interrogating these sources yielded valuable intelligence about how Nazi security services operated and what information would most disturb them. British intelligence also studied captured German documents. When Allied forces overran German positions in North Africa and Italy, they captured Nazi files containing organizational information, personnel records, and operational documents. Analysts mined these documents for details that could be weaponized in psychological operations. The challenge was selecting what information to include in the leaflet. Too little information, and Nazi officials might dismiss it as Allied guesswork. Too much accurate information, and the leaflet might reveal the extent of Allied intelligence penetration, potentially compromising ongoing operations. The information needed to be dramatic enough to create panic, but not so specific that it endangered Allied sources. British psychological warfare experts decided to mix several types of information. First, they'd include accurate details about Nazi officials' personal lives, information that would be shocking to see in enemy propaganda but wouldn't reveal critical intelligence methods. Second, they'd reference real Nazi operations using enough detail to suggest insider knowledge while obscuring how Allies actually learned this information. Third, they'd include some false information, calibrated to trigger paranoid Nazi investigations that would waste German counterintelligence resources. The text of the leaflet was crafted by German-speaking intelligence officers who understood Nazi bureaucratic language and communication styles. The writing needed to sound like it came from dissident Germans rather than obvious Allied propaganda. This meant using specific German terminology, referencing internal Nazi politics, and adopting tones that German readers would recognize as authentically German rather than foreign propaganda translated into German. Several drafts were tested on German prisoners of war and anti-Nazi German exiles working with British intelligence. These test audiences reviewed drafts, identifying elements that seemed credible versus obviously false, suggesting improvements to language and content. Their feedback refined the leaflet until psychological warfare experts believed it would achieve maximum impact. Visual design was also carefully considered. The leaflet needed to look like clandestine resistance material rather than official Allied propaganda. It was designed to appear as if produced by German resistance networks. Simple black and white printing, no elaborate graphics, format suggesting underground publication rather than government production. This visual presentation was critical to the psychological operation's success. Production used high-quality paper and printing that matched German standards. If the leaflet looked like it was printed on British equipment using British materials, Germans would immediately recognize it as Allied propaganda. But if it appeared to be printed on German equipment, it would seem more likely to have originated from within Germany, reinforcing the impression that the information came from German resistance sources or traitors within Nazi organizations. The drop, delivering the weapon. The actual leaflet distribution operation required precise coordination between British intelligence services and RAF Bomber Command. The timing, location, and method of delivery were all calibrated for maximum psychological impact. The operation was scheduled for mid-August 1943, a period when Allied bombing of Berlin was intensifying. This timing was deliberate. The leaflet drop would occur during a period of high stress for Nazi authorities and Berlin civilians. The psychological impact would be amplified by the existing anxiety about Allied attacks. The target area was carefully selected. Rather than distributing the leaflet citywide, British intelligence chose specific neighborhoods where Nazi officials and Gestapo personnel lived and worked. The goal wasn't maximum distribution to German civilians, but targeted delivery to the Nazi hierarchy, who were the leaflet's real audience. Dropping the leaflets specifically in areas where Nazi officials would find them reinforced the impression that Allied intelligence knew exactly where Nazi personnel operated. RAF aircraft assigned to the mission were from squadrons conducting regular bombing raids on Berlin. The leaflet drop was coordinated with an actual bombing mission, providing cover for the operation. German air defenses would focus on the bombers, not noticing that some aircraft were also dropping propaganda leaflets. This operational security was critical. If Germans realized the leaflets were being delivered as a special operation, they might treat them differently. The leaflets were packaged in bundles designed to break apart at specific altitudes, scattering them over target areas.
Specialized leaflet bombs, cylindrical containers that opened midair, were used for precision distribution. These devices had been developed specifically for propaganda operations and could deliver leaflets to remarkably precise locations. The night of the operation, RAF aircraft departed from British bases, crossed the North Sea, and penetrated German airspace en route to Berlin. German air defenses activated. Searchlights swept the sky, anti-aircraft guns fired, night fighters scrambled to intercept. The bomber formations proceeded toward their targets, releasing high-explosive bombs on industrial and military targets in Berlin.
Mixed with the bombing run, specific aircraft released their leaflet bombs over predetermined neighborhoods. The cylindrical containers tumbled through the darkness, opening at calculated altitudes to scatter thousands of leaflets across designated areas. The leaflets drifted down through smoke and searchlight beams, landing throughout target neighborhoods while bombs exploded elsewhere in the city. By morning, as Berliners emerged from bomb shelters to assess damage from the night's raid, they discovered the leaflets. Some found them on doorsteps, others discovered them in courtyards or gardens. Still others saw them scattered in streets. The leaflets appeared to be everywhere, a paper assault accompanying the explosive assault. German authorities immediately recognized the leaflets as enemy propaganda and began collection efforts. Nazi block wardens, neighborhood officials responsible for civil defense and political control, were ordered to gather and destroy all leaflets. The Gestapo warned civilians that possessing enemy propaganda was a criminal offense. But collection was impossible. Too many leaflets had been distributed across too wide an area for comprehensive recovery. More critically, Nazi officials themselves found and read the leaflets before collection efforts began. Gestapo officers arriving at offices found leaflets on their doorsteps. SD officials discovered them in neighborhoods where they lived. This was exactly what British intelligence intended, ensuring that the leaflet's target audience encountered the material before it could be completely suppressed. The content, what the leaflet revealed. The leaflet's specific content was designed to maximize paranoia among Nazi officials while providing plausible deniability about Allied intelligence sources. Understanding what it said reveals the sophistication of British psychological warfare. The leaflet was titled An das deutsche Volk und die Wehrmacht, to the German people and armed forces, a heading that suggested it came from German resistance rather than Allied intelligence. The opening paragraphs established a tone of patriotic Germans warning their countrymen about Nazi treachery and Allied intelligence penetration. The core content included several categories of information designed to create maximum alarm among Nazi officials while providing plausible deniability about Allied intelligence sources. Understanding what it said reveals the sophistication of British psychological warfare. The leaflet was titled An das deutsche Volk und die Wehrmacht, to the German people and armed forces, a heading that suggested it came from German resistance rather than Allied intelligence. The opening paragraphs established a tone of patriotic Germans warning their countrymen about Nazi treachery and Allied intelligence penetration. The core content included several categories of information designed to create maximum alarm among Nazi officials. First were names and addresses of alleged resistance safe houses in Berlin. The leaflet listed specific addresses, street names, and building numbers, claiming these locations served as meeting places for anti-Nazi resistance networks. Some of these addresses were real resistance safe houses that Gestapo had already discovered, lending credibility. Others were completely fictional, designed to waste Gestapo resources investigating non-existent conspiracies. Second were details about Nazi officials' personal lives, information that was accurate but embarrassing or compromising. The leaflet mentioned a Gestapo officer's affair with his secretary, providing enough detail to confirm the information was real. It referenced an SD official's black market activities. It described the private doubts expressed by a Wehrmacht general at a dinner party. These personal details were shocking. How did the enemy know such intimate information?
Third were references to actual intelligence operations, described with enough accuracy to prove insider knowledge but vaguely enough to avoid compromising current Allied intelligence work. The leaflet mentioned Operation X, a real German counterintelligence operation, and claimed Allied intelligence had penetrated it. It referenced specific dates when German security sweeps had occurred, suggesting Allied spies had advance warning. Fourth were predictions about future Allied operations, some accurate, others deliberate misinformation designed to trigger German defensive responses that would waste resources. The leaflet claimed that Allied intelligence was preparing major operations in specific sectors, causing Germans to strengthen security in those areas even when no actual operations were planned there. Fifth, most devastatingly, were implications that traitors existed at high levels of Nazi hierarchy. The leaflet didn't directly name specific traitors, but suggested strongly that Allied intelligence had sources within the SS, Gestapo, Wehrmacht intelligence, and Nazi Party leadership. It described the kind of information these supposed traitors were providing: operational details, personnel information, strategic planning documents, in ways that suggested deep penetration. The cumulative effect was designed to create cascading paranoia. Each category of information would trigger different responses from Nazi security services. Personal revelations would make officials fear their private lives were being monitored. Operational details would suggest intelligence leaks. Predictions would seem to confirm that Allies had advance warning of German activities. And implications of traitors existing at high levels of Nazi hierarchy would make Nazi officials suspect each other. The leaflet concluded with a call to German patriots to recognize that Nazi leadership had failed Germany, that the war was lost, and that continuing to fight only guaranteed German destruction. This ideological component was standard propaganda, but it gained power from the accurate intelligence that preceded it. If the Allies knew so much about German operations, perhaps they were right about the war's outcome too. Critically, the leaflet included no information that would compromise actual Allied intelligence sources or ongoing operations. British intelligence had carefully calibrated content to maximize psychological impact while protecting intelligence assets. The personal revelations came from sources Germans couldn't easily trace. The operational details were already partially known to Germans or described vaguely enough to avoid revealing Allied intelligence methods. The panic, Nazi response. The Nazi security services' response to the leaflet was exactly what British intelligence hoped for: immediate, extreme, and counterproductive. The panic that ensued reveals both the leaflet's effectiveness and the fragility of Nazi internal security. Within hours of the leaflet's discovery, Gestapo headquarters received hundreds of reports from field offices throughout Berlin. Officers reported finding the leaflets in their neighborhoods. Block wardens described widespread distribution. Security sweeps recovered thousands of copies, but many more remained in circulation despite collection efforts.
The Gestapo's immediate response was to investigate the accuracy of the leaflet's claims. Officers were assigned to verify the information about resistance safe houses. When investigators discovered that several addresses mentioned in the leaflet were indeed associated with resistance activity, either active safe houses or locations previously identified in investigations, alarm escalated. The enemy's information was accurate. Investigation of the personal revelations confirmed their accuracy as well. The Gestapo officer's affair, the SD official's black market dealings, the general's private comments, these details checked out. This confirmation was devastating. It meant Allied intelligence had penetrated deep enough to know intimate details about Nazi officials' personal lives. How? Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS and Gestapo, ordered comprehensive investigations. He demanded to know how Allied intelligence had obtained this information. Who had leaked it? How extensive was the penetration? Were there traitors in his own organizations? The investigations quickly became internal witch hunts. Officials with access to the information revealed in the leaflet were interrogated.
Anyone who'd been at the dinner party where the general expressed doubts faced suspicion. Personnel who knew about the Gestapo officer's affair were investigated for potential espionage. The paranoia spread exponentially as each investigation uncovered more people who might have had access to compromising information. Trust collapsed within Nazi security organizations. Officers suspected subordinates of being Allied spies. Colleagues suspected each other. Senior officials wondered whether their own staff were reporting to the enemy. The internal cohesion necessary for effective counterintelligence work disintegrated as everyone became a potential suspect. The Gestapo arrested dozens of people on suspicion of espionage or resistance activity. Some were genuine resistance members who'd been operating under Gestapo surveillance. Others were completely innocent individuals caught up in paranoid investigations triggered by the leaflet. Interrogations were brutal, with suspects tortured to extract confessions about Allied intelligence contacts they didn't actually have. The SD compiled extensive reports analyzing the leaflet and attempting to determine its source. Analysts recognized that the leaflet represented sophisticated psychological warfare, but that understanding didn't reduce its impact. Even knowing they were being manipulated, Nazi officials couldn't ignore the accurate intelligence the leaflet contained. The fact that enemies knew so much about German operations demanded investigation regardless of the psychological warfare component. Wehrmacht intelligence services conducted parallel investigations. Military counterintelligence was already concerned about security breaches, and the leaflet confirmed their worst fears. They launched their own internal investigations, suspecting that someone with access to military planning had leaked information to the Allies. The investigations consumed enormous resources. Hundreds of Gestapo and SD personnel were diverted from normal counterintelligence work to investigate the leaflet's revelations. This was exactly what British intelligence intended, paralyzing German counterintelligence by making them turn inward rather than hunting Allied spies. While German security services investigated each other, actual Allied intelligence networks continued operating with reduced pressure. The panic extended beyond security services to the broader Nazi hierarchy. Party officials not mentioned in the leaflet nonetheless worried about what else Allied intelligence might know. Ministers wondered if their communications were being intercepted. Hitler himself reportedly demanded explanations for how the enemy had obtained such detailed information about German operations. Nazi counterpropaganda attempted to dismiss the leaflet as Allied psychological warfare, but the propaganda was unconvincing. German radio broadcasts and newspapers claimed the leaflet contained only lies and Allied fabrications. But Nazi officials who'd verified the accuracy of the leaflet's claims knew this counter-propaganda was false, creating additional trust problems. If Nazi propaganda was lying about the leaflet, what else was it lying about? The lasting effect was institutional paranoia that persisted long after the immediate crisis. Nazi security services never fully recovered the internal trust that the leaflet destroyed. Officers remained suspicious of colleagues. Information sharing became more restricted as organizations hoarded intelligence rather than sharing it, fearing leaks. Counterintelligence effectiveness declined as resources were wasted on internal investigations rather than external threats. The aftermath: cascading consequences. The leaflet operation's consequences extended far beyond the immediate panic it created. The cascading effects on Nazi Germany's security apparatus and internal politics revealed how a single well-crafted psychological operation could produce strategic results. The most immediate consequence was degraded counterintelligence effectiveness. With Gestapo and SD resources diverted to investigating internal leaks suggested by the leaflet, Allied intelligence networks operating in Germany faced reduced pressure. British MI6 and SOE networks reported that German counterintelligence activities appeared disrupted for weeks following the leaflet drop, providing opportunities to expand operations and recruit new sources. The investigations triggered by the leaflet also created genuine intelligence bonanzas for the Allies. German officials arrested and interrogated during the paranoid witch hunts sometimes included individuals who might actually be recruited as Allied sources. Nazis who'd felt unjustly accused or who'd become disillusioned with the regime approached Allied intelligence offering to provide information. The investigations created exactly the traitors the leaflet had implied existed.
German resistance networks benefited indirectly. The chaos in Nazi security services provided cover for actual resistance activities, while Gestapo resources were consumed investigating phantom traitors suggested by the leaflet. Real resistance networks operated with greater freedom. Some German military officers who'd been contemplating opposition to Hitler became more convinced that Allied intelligence could support their efforts. If the Allies knew so much about Nazi operations already, perhaps coordination would be possible. The leaflet operation also demonstrated the vulnerability of authoritarian systems to well-targeted psychological warfare. Nazi Germany's internal security depended on fear, surveillance, and ruthless punishment of dissent. But these same characteristics made the system vulnerable to paranoia. When the system turned inward, suspecting its own members, it became less effective at suppressing actual opposition. British intelligence learned valuable lessons from the operation's success. The political warfare executive analyzed why this particular leaflet had been so effective, identifying principles that could be applied to future psychological operations. The key insight was that propaganda targeting enemy leadership and security services could be as valuable as propaganda targeting civilian populations, perhaps more valuable because causing organizational dysfunction had force multiplier effects. The success prompted additional operations using similar approaches. British intelligence conducted several follow-up leaflet drops over Berlin and other German cities, each containing calibrated intelligence revelations designed to maintain paranoia within Nazi organizations. While none achieved quite the dramatic impact of the original operation, the cumulative effect kept Nazi counterintelligence resources focused inward rather than on hunting Allied spies. German attempts to prevent similar operations revealed how deeply the original leaflet had affected them. Nazi authorities implemented stricter controls on information access, creating compartmentalization that made their own organizations less efficient. They conducted extensive vetting of personnel with access to sensitive information, consuming additional resources and creating bottlenecks in intelligence processing. The defensive measures they adopted to prevent future intelligence leaks actually degraded their operational effectiveness. The leaflet also had propaganda value beyond its intelligence warfare purposes. News of the panic it caused in Berlin spread through underground resistance networks and eventually reached Allied intelligence. This intelligence was used in subsequent propaganda directed at German civilians, emphasizing that Nazi leadership was losing control and that Allied intelligence had penetrated the Reich's highest levels. The leaflet's success became self-reinforcing propaganda. Some historians argue that the cumulative effect of operations like this leaflet drop contributed to the July 1944 assassination attempt against Hitler. The atmosphere of paranoia and internal suspicion within Nazi Germany made military officers planning the coup more confident that they could act without immediate detection. The sense that Allied intelligence had deeply penetrated Nazi organizations suggested potential Allied support for post-coup governments. Post-war analysis revealed that the actual Allied intelligence penetration of Nazi Germany, while significant, was less extensive than the leaflet suggested. Much of the information in the leaflet came from signals intelligence, escaped prisoners, and ordinary investigative work rather than high-level traitors. But the leaflet's brilliance was making Germans believe the penetration was deeper than it actually was, creating paranoia disproportionate to real threats. The operation also demonstrated risks of psychological warfare. Creating panic within enemy organizations could sometimes produce unpredictable results. In this case, the panic led Nazi security services to arrest innocent people and conduct brutal interrogations, collateral damage from the psychological operation. British intelligence had to weigh these consequences against the strategic benefits of disrupting Nazi counterintelligence. The legacy: psychological warfare lessons.
The spy leaflet operation that sparked panic in Berlin became a classic case study in psychological warfare, influencing subsequent intelligence operations and modern information warfare strategies. Understanding its legacy reveals enduring principles of strategic communication targeting enemy organizations. The operation established that well-crafted propaganda targeting enemy leadership and security services could achieve strategic effects exceeding traditional propaganda targeting civilian populations. This insight influenced Cold War psychological operations, where both sides devoted significant resources to creating doubt and paranoia within opposing intelligence services. CIA and KGB operations during the Cold War frequently attempted to replicate the Berlin leaflet success, creating internal suspicion within enemy organizations through carefully calibrated information operations. Defector programs, compromising material releases, and strategic leaks all drew inspiration from techniques pioneered in operations like the Berlin leaflet drop. Modern information warfare reflects principles established by this operation. Contemporary psychological operations still target enemy organizations' internal cohesion, attempting to create doubt, destroy trust, and trigger counterproductive defensive responses. The methods have evolved. Digital communications replace paper leaflets, but the strategic logic remains identical. The operation also demonstrated the value of combining accurate intelligence with strategic misinformation. The leaflet's power came from mixing verifiable truths with false implications, making it impossible for targets to dismiss the entire message while simultaneously being unable to determine which specific elements were true versus false. This ambiguity maximized psychological impact while minimizing risk to actual intelligence sources. Intelligence training curricula include the Berlin leaflet operation as an example of effective psychological warfare. Future intelligence officers study how the operation was planned, executed, and exploited to understand principles of targeting organizational psychology rather than just individual psychology. The case demonstrates that institutions can be manipulated through understanding their internal dynamics and exploiting organizational vulnerabilities. The operation raised ethical questions about psychological warfare's boundaries that remain relevant today. Creating panic that leads to arrests, interrogations, and potentially executions of innocent people raises moral concerns. British intelligence considered these ethical dimensions, but judged that disrupting Nazi security services justified the collateral damage. Contemporary debates about information warfare ethics echo these World War II dilemmas.
Historians studying the operation have identified several factors that made it particularly effective. The timing, during a period of high stress when Berlin was under heavy bombing, amplified psychological impact. The targeting, focusing on Nazi officials rather than general population, ensured the message reached the intended audience. The calibration, mixing accurate intelligence with strategic deception, created maximum uncertainty. And the follow-up, subsequent operations maintaining pressure, prevented Nazi countermeasures from fully neutralizing the initial impact. The operation also revealed vulnerabilities inherent in authoritarian systems. Organizations built on fear and surveillance are particularly susceptible to internal paranoia. When members already fear each other because of the repressive system's nature, introducing additional grounds for suspicion through psychological operations can trigger devastating internal dysfunction. Democratic systems with greater internal trust and transparency are somewhat less vulnerable to this specific type of psychological warfare. Modern adversaries study World War II psychological operations like the Berlin leaflet drop to develop their own information warfare capabilities. State and non-state actors attempting to disrupt enemy organizations frequently employ variants of these techniques, releasing compromising information, suggesting internal betrayals, and creating ambiguity about intelligence penetration to trigger counterproductive defensive responses. The digitization of information has made psychological operations both easier and more difficult.
Digital communications allow much faster and broader distribution of psychological warfare messages, but digital forensics also make attribution and verification easier. The Berlin leaflet operation benefited from the difficulty of tracing printed leaflets' origins. Modern digital operations face greater challenges maintaining attribution ambiguity. Closing. The power of precision panic. The spy leaflet that sparked panic in Berlin during World War II represents psychological warfare at its most sophisticated and effective. British intelligence didn't simply drop propaganda hoping it might influence someone. They crafted a precision instrument designed to exploit specific vulnerabilities in Nazi Germany's security apparatus, triggering exactly the kind of paranoid internal dysfunction that would maximize strategic benefit to Allied operations. The genius lay in understanding organizational psychology, recognizing that authoritarian systems built on fear and surveillance were particularly vulnerable to internal paranoia. By introducing carefully calibrated information suggesting deep intelligence penetration, the leaflet activated pre-existing suspicions within Nazi organizations. It made them see traitors where none existed, waste resources hunting phantoms, and destroy the internal trust necessary for effective counterintelligence work. The panic the leaflet created was disproportionate to the actual threat it represented. Most of the intelligence it contained was already somewhat known to Germans or described vaguely enough to avoid compromising Allied sources. But the presentation, the specific details, the accurate personal revelations, the implications of high-level penetration made Nazi officials believe Allied intelligence knew far more than it actually did. The perception of threat exceeded the reality, and in psychological warfare, perception is reality. Nazi security services consumed enormous resources investigating internal leaks that largely didn't exist, while actual Allied intelligence networks continued operating with reduced pressure. The Gestapo arrested innocent people, interrogated loyal Nazis, and created genuine resistance where only loyalty had previously existed. The defensive measures adopted to prevent imagined intelligence breaches made German organizations less efficient. One leaflet, dropped on one night, created cascading dysfunction that persisted for months. The human cost deserves acknowledgement. Germans arrested during paranoid investigations triggered by the leaflet suffered real torture and imprisonment. Some may have been executed. British intelligence accepted this collateral damage as justified by the strategic benefits of disrupting Nazi counterintelligence, but the moral complexity remains. Psychological warfare isn't bloodless warfare, it simply shifts violence from battlefields to different domains. The operation proved that words can be as powerful as weapons when precisely targeted and carefully calibrated. The leaflet didn't need to convince all Germans, or even most Germans. It only needed to convince the small number of Nazi officials responsible for internal security that their organizations had been penetrated. By achieving that narrow goal with extraordinary precision, it produced strategic effects that no amount of general propaganda could have accomplished. If this deep dive into the spy leaflet that sparked panic in Berlin and paralyzed Nazi counterintelligence captivated you, please subscribe to Cipher Tales for more decoded mysteries from the hidden history of World War II. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our next upload. Like this video if you found it revealing and thought-provoking. Every like helps us reach more people who appreciate the complex, hidden dimensions of history. Comment below and tell us, were you surprised by how effectively one leaflet could disrupt an entire security apparatus? Can you see parallels to modern information warfare operations designed to create internal organizational dysfunction? What other World War II propaganda and espionage intersections should we decode next? Other British black propaganda operations? The psychology of organizational paranoia in wartime? German counter-propaganda efforts that backfired? Share this video with anyone fascinated by psychological warfare, intelligence operations, organizational psychology, and the hidden ways wars are fought through manipulating perception and creating strategic panic. Until then, remember, the most devastating attacks are sometimes those that make enemies destroy themselves through fear of threats that may not even exist. This has been Cipher Tales. Keep questioning, keep decoding, keep discovering the secrets that changed history.